Evelyn Parker was seen as just another mother in a quiet town, and her 12-year-old daughter, Clara, was known for her bright smile and gentle nature. But beneath the surface of their ordinary lives lay a horrifying secret. When Evelyn led Clara deep into the forest one autumn afternoon, it wasn't tea for a peaceful walk. It was for a chilling plan that would shock everyone who thought they knew them. Evelyn Parker lived in a small, quiet neighborhood where life moved at a steady pace. To the casual observer, she was just another single mother doing her best to raise a daughter on her own. She smiled at neighbors when they passed by, kept her lawn tidy, and made sure Clara, her 12-year-old daughter, was always dressed neatly for school. People thought of her as private, perhaps a little withdrawn, but no one suspected anything unusual. Clara herself was a bright child, known at school for her intelligence and gentle nature. Teachers admired her for her curiosity, while classmates described her as shy but kind-hearted. Yet behind the curtains of their modest home, life was not as peaceful as it seemed from the outside. Evelyn had been carrying heavy burdens for years. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, each one a reminder of the job she had lost months earlier. Debt collectors called often, their voices sharp and demanding, and Evelyn struggled to keep up with even the basic costs of living. Friends she once relied on had slowly pulled away, tired of her unpredictability and strange behavior. She seemed distracted, sometimes irritable, other times locked in silence for hours. Clara noticed these changes but was too young to fully understand. All she knew was that her mother seemed weighed down by something she could not name. Despite her troubles, Evelyn worked hard to maintain an image of normalcy. Every morning, she walked Clara to the bus stop, waved goodbye, and assured other parents she was doing fine. At home, though, her mind was a storm. She replayed the disappointments of her life, the broken relationship with Clara's father, the jobs she could never keep, the growing loneliness that clung to her like a shadow. More than once, she sat at the edge of her bed staring at the wall, wondering how she would ever make it through another day. Her relationship with Clara grew complicated under this weight. Evelyn loved her daughter deeply, but she also felt trapped. Caring for a child alone with no support only made the pressure worse. Clara became the center of her world, but in Evelyn's fragile state of mind, that devotion turned into something darker. She rarely allowed Clara to go to friends' houses or join after-school activities. She insisted that her daughter stay close, convincing herself it was for protection. Neighbors whispered that she was overprotective, though most assumed it was just the way some single mothers coped. No one thought to look deeper. Clara sensed that her life was different from other children's. She longed to laugh freely with friends, to ride her bike to the park without her mother watching every move. At night, she sometimes overheard Evelyn muttering to herself in the next room, the sound of a voice too low to understand, but heavy enough to unsettle her. Still, Clara trusted her mother completely. She believed that all of her mother's strict rules came from love. To her young mind, there was nothing more certain than that bond. But in Evelyn's world, certainty had already begun to crumble. The weight of her debts, her isolation, and the quiet unraveling of her thoughts created a dangerous mixture. She had started to believe that Clara's very existence was linked to her suffering, that if she could escape the responsibilities of motherhood, her life might somehow find peace again. These thoughts grew stronger in the quiet hours, seeping into her mind, until they no longer felt like fleeting fears, but twisted solutions. What looked like an ordinary family from the outside was, in reality, standing on the edge of a terrible secret, waiting to break into the open. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Evelyn suggested to Clara that they go for a walk. The idea seemed harmless, even pleasant. Clara loved the outdoors, especially when the leaves had begun to turn golden and red, and she jumped at the chance to spend time with her mother away from the routine of school and home. Evelyn packed a small bag before they left. To Clara, it looked like she was carrying only a blanket and a bottle of water. the kind of things one might take for a picnic. Hidden deep inside the folds of Evelyn's coat, however, was something Clara could not see, something that would change the meaning of their walk forever. The forest they entered was not far from the edge of town, but felt like an entirely different world. Tall trees rose like silent towers, their branches weaving together to block much of the sunlight. The air was cool and damp, filled with the earthy smell of fallen leaves and moss. Birds called out in distant echoes, and the sound of their feet crunching on the path was the only other noise. At first, Clara enjoyed it. She skipped a little, pointing out squirrels darting up trunks and the way the sunlight filtered in patches through the canopy. Evelyn smiled faintly, but her steps were quick, purposeful, almost urgent. The deeper they walked, the more the forest swallowed them. The sound of cars, the laughter of children playing outside, even the faint hum of town life was gone. It was as if they had stepped into a space cut off from the rest of the world. Clara began to notice the difference in her mother's behavior. Evelyn's eyes flicked around the trees, and she held the bag tightly to her side. She was not looking at the beauty of the woods, nor was she listening to the birds or enjoying the peace. Instead, she seemed restless, her mind fixed on something hidden. Clara's excitement started to waver. She asked a few questions about where they were going, but Evelyn only answered in short, distracted phrases. There was a tension in the air that Clara could not quite understand. She followed anyway, her trust in her mother unshaken, but she felt the unease growing stronger with every step. The forest path narrowed, winding deeper into thick undergrowth. The trees closed in above them, making the daylight seem dimmer. Clara looked around, realizing she had never been this deep before. She wondered why her mother had chosen this path when so many easier trails were closer to town. Evelyn's breathing grew heavier as they climbed a small incline and reached a clearing. It was a secluded spot, shielded on all sides by tall trees and dense shrubs. The ground was covered in soft moss, with just enough open space to spread out the blanket she had brought. She set the bag down carefully, her hands trembling just slightly. Clara, unaware of the storm building inside her mother's mind, thought they were stopping to rest. She sat down on the blanket, her young eyes wide with innocence, her trust unbroken. Evelyn stood nearby, silent, staring at the trees as though listening for something only she could hear. The stillness of the forest wrapped around them. The wind had slowed, the birds had quieted, and even the rustle of small creatures seemed to vanish. Clara shifted uncomfortably on the blanket, sensing that this was not the peaceful picnic she had imagined. Her mother's silence stretched on, heavy and unnatural. She felt for the first time that something was wrong, though she could not yet name the danger that waited in the shadows of the trees. Evelyn had brought Clara to the forest with a plan that had been taking shape in her mind for weeks. It had begun as a fleeting thought on nights when the weight of her life pressed too hard on her chest, a whisper in her head telling her that she could not go on like this. At first, she had pushed it aside, horrified at herself, but the idea had a way of returning, stronger each time, until it no longer felt like a thought but a command. She convinced herself that Clara's existence was the root of her misery, the reason she was trapped in a cycle of debt, loneliness, and despair. She told herself that if she no longer had to care for a child, her life might finally be free of pressure. The forest was her answer, a secluded place where no one would see, where no one would know until it was far too late. As she stood in the clearing, she felt her heartbeat quicken. The knife inside her coat seemed to burn against her skin, a reminder of the terrible decision she had already made. She glanced at Clara, who was sitting on the blanket with wide eyes, pulling at the threads of the fabric, completely unaware of what her mother intended. That innocence, the trust shining in her daughter's face, cut through Evelyn like a blade of its own. For a moment, her resolve wavered. She almost told herself to stop, to pick up the blanket and walk home. But then the voice inside her returned, cruel and insistent, telling her that she had come too far to turn back. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the stillness pressed down, amplifying every sound, the crunch of Evelyn's shoes on the leaves, the faint creak of the trees as they swayed, the steady rhythm of Clara's breathing. Evelyn moved slowly, reaching into her coat. Her hand brushed against the cold steel of the knife, and a shiver raced through her body. She pulled it halfway out, her fingers tightening around the handle, her mind a storm of doubt and determination. Her eyes flicked toward Clara, who had now turned her head toward the trees, distracted by the sound of a bird's wings. Clara shifted on the blanket, humming softly to herself, unaware that her life balanced on a knife's edge. Evelyn's hand trembled. She told herself this was for the best, that her daughter would never suffer the hardships of the world, that she herself would be free at last. She took a step closer, her shadow falling across Clara, her breathing shallow and unsteady. The scene felt unreal, as if she were watching herself from outside her own body. In that moment, Evelyn's thoughts raced wildly. She imagined the silence that would follow, the questions from neighbors when Clara never came home, the police searching the town but never finding the truth. She imagined herself walking away lighter, carrying no more burdens. Yet a flicker of fear twisted inside her, fear that she could not control what would come next, fear that once she crossed the line, she could never return. The knife gleamed faintly in the filtered light as her hand tightened around it. The forest, quiet and watchful, seemed to wait for her choice. Evelyn stood frozen in the clearing, the knife heavy in her hand, the weight of her decision pressing harder than ever. Her breath came in uneven gasps as she looked down at Clara, who was still seated on the blanket, oblivious to the storm of danger that hung over her. The silence of the forest was thick, wrapping around them like a shroud. Every rustle of leaves seemed to echo louder than it should, and Evelyn's grip on the knife faltered for just a second. That was when an unexpected sound cut through the air, footsteps approaching from beyond the trees. At first, Evelyn thought it was her imagination, a trick of her nerves, but the steady crunch of leaves grew louder, closer, undeniable. She stiffened, quickly sliding the knife back beneath her coat. Clara's head lifted at once, her eyes brightening with curiosity. She did not sense the terror coursing through her mother. Instead, she seemed relieved that they were no longer alone. From the thick brush at the edge of the clearing emerged a man in hiking boots, his figure weathered from years of walking trails. He carried a backpack and a walking stick, his pace unhurried, his expression calm. He had not expected to stumble across anyone in such a secluded part of the forest. The man greeted them with a nod, his presence breaking the suffocating stillness. To him, it was just a chance encounter on a hike, but to Evelyn, it was a disaster unraveling her plan. Her body stiffened, her pale face betraying a flicker of panic. The hiker noticed her unease, though he could not understand its cause. Clara, quick to sense a change in the air, scrambled to her feet and instinctively stepped closer to the man, as if drawn to the safety of another human being. Evelyn's eyes darted between them, her mind racing. For weeks, she had planned this moment, convinced she could carry it out unseen, but now the forest was no longer empty. Her carefully chosen isolation had betrayed her. She knew that any sudden movement, any attempt to go through with her plan, would now be witnessed. The hiker's sharp eyes would catch everything, and the chance to vanish without a trace was gone. Evelyn felt the walls of her mind closing in. Her heart pounded with a violent rhythm, not from determination anymore, but from fear of being exposed. The man began to make small talk, mentioning how far the trail stretched and how beautiful the leaves were this time of year. Clara listened politely, nodding, grateful for the distraction. Evelyn barely heard the words. She kept one hand pressed to the inside of her coat, feeling the hidden knife like a brand against her skin, yet knowing it was useless now. She forced a smile, a mask stretched thin over the chaos beneath, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her tension whenever she spoke. As the hiker lingered, looking from mother to daughter, something about the scene unsettled him. The girl seemed restless, uneasy, and the mother's strained demeanor raised unspoken questions. Though he said nothing, he stayed nearby longer than necessary, instinctively sensing that leaving might not be the right choice. Evelyn's plan had crumbled in seconds. The opportunity she thought was perfect had been ripped from her grasp by the simple chance of another pair of footsteps on the path. In her chest, anger mixed with relief in a confusing storm. She had been so close, closer than ever before, yet now she could not act without being caught. She stood silently in the clearing, the knife untouched, her thoughts unraveling, as the forest bore witness to the collapse of the terrible secret she had carried inside. The arrival of the hiker marked the end of Evelyn's chance, but it also marked the beginning of her unraveling. She could not shake the feeling that he had seen too much, that he had sensed the tension she tried so desperately to conceal. As Clara stood close to the man, her small frame leaning ever so slightly toward him for comfort, Evelyn felt the last threads of her plan fall apart. She forced herself to smile, to act as though this was nothing more than a casual outing, but inside her mind, panic surged like a rising tide. The knife remained hidden beneath her coat, pressing cold against her ribs, a constant reminder of what she had intended to do but could no longer carry out. The hiker eventually excused himself, continuing along the trail, though not without one last glance back at the uneasy scene. Clara waved politely, and Evelyn stood stiff, her heart hammering as she realized how completely the moment had slipped from her control. She told herself she could still try again another day, that the chance might return, but deep down, she knew the forest no longer held the secrecy she believed in. Someone had witnessed her there with Clara, someone who could remember the way her face had looked, pale and tight with nerves. That memory could come back to haunt her. When they left the clearing and walked home, Clara noticed her mother's silence. The girl had felt something strange in the forest, though she did not know what. Evelyn's grip on her daughter's hand was too tight, her steps too fast, and she spoke almost nothing until they reached their house. Clara retreated to her room, unsettled, while Evelyn sat at the kitchen table staring at the knife she had pulled from her coat and placed in front of her. It was no longer just an object. It was evidence of what she had nearly done. Her mind spiraled through what might have happened if the hiker had not appeared, if Clara had not stood up when she did, if the forest had stayed silent as Evelyn had imagined. The truth did not stay buried for long. Days later, suspicions grew when the hiker, still troubled by the encounter, quietly shared what he had seen. He mentioned the tense expression on the mother's face, the way the child had looked uneasy, and how the whole scene had felt wrong. Authorities began to take notice. When questions were asked, Evelyn stumbled over her answers. The cracks in her story widened, and eventually investigators uncovered enough to reveal her intentions. The knife, her debts, and her unstable behavior painted a chilling picture of a woman on the edge, ready to take the unthinkable step. Clara was placed into protective care, shielded from the danger that had come so close to stealing her life. She would grow up knowing the truth, that her mother, the person she trusted most, had planned to betray her in the cruelest way possible. Evelyn, meanwhile, faced the consequences of her actions, her name forever tied to the crime she had not completed but had fully intended. What haunted everyone who learned the story was how close it had come to tragedy, how an ordinary family had hidden such darkness, and how a single stranger's footsteps through the forest had changed everything. The town never looked at Evelyn the same again, and the story of the mother who led her daughter into the woods became a chilling reminder of how thin the line between love and danger can sometimes be.